It's really a pleasure for me to introduce a former colleague from NYU and also a very good friend. Parikh is Associate Professor at New York University in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis and also in the Department of English, where she is also serving as the graduate student advisor or director of graduate studies. She specializes in 20th century and contemporary American literature and culture with a focus on comparative race and ethnic studies, as well as ethical and political theory and gender and sexuality, diaspora, and post-colonial studies. In addition to numerous articles, and she publishes in really a wide array of journals. In 2009, Professor Parikh published her book, her manuscript, An Ethics of Betrayal, The Politics of Otherness in Emergent U.S. Literature and Culture. And that book won an amazing award from the MLA, excuse me, it's not with my usual, I'm an anthropologist, but the Modern Language Association Prize in the United States in Latina and Latino and Chicano Literary Studies. She's currently completing her second manuscript called Writing Human Rights and co-editing a volume with Daniel Kim on the Cambridge Companion to Asian American Literature. So please join me in welcoming Professor Crystal Parikh.
Thank you so much to Locke, Sue, for inviting me to come here and present this material and to the Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies program for hosting me. And to Dennis, I don't know if he's here, for the wonderful flyers.
Royce is here. And
I love the flyers, so thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for taking time out of your day. Okay, so I will begin. The title, as you can see, is Disabling American Good Life, Minor Literatures, and the Human Right to Health. And today's talk is coming from my book, Manuscript in Progress, which Locke just mentioned, which is titled Writing Human Rights. I'm leaving out the subtitle because I just keep playing and changing it, and so it's in flux. But in this project, I'm trying to devise what I call a human rights literacy or methodology for reading minor literatures, by contemporary U.S. writers of color. This human rights method, I'm arguing, unlocks a range of political claims in this literature well beyond ones for inclusion or abstract equality. Each chapter is organized around a normative human rights principle codified in international human rights instruments, for example, the right to standing or the right to self-determination. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time right now describing this larger project because of the limits of time, but I think what I want to do is just launch right into the specific subject of human rights and the specific subject of the rights of the persons with disabilities and the right to health, right? And I think in this way I can kind of demonstrate this method that is at play in the entire book. So, okay, so let's start with the first slide here. So, in 2006, the United Nations adopted the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which I'll be calling the CRPD for short, the purpose of which, as stated in Article 1 of the Convention, is to promote, protect, and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disabilities, and to promote respect for their inherent dignity. The CRPD, in fact, reaffirmed the rights, such as the freedom of expression and the right to bodily security, cataloged in many other instruments, most significantly the International Bill of Rights for Persons with Disabilities. And so the International Bill of Rights is drafted and signed in like the 1940s, right? Or at least drafted in the 1940s. Signed, there are various parts of it are signed later, but the adoption of the CRPD thus made visible how, although persons with disabilities theoretically were to enjoy the same rights as other human beings, these individuals have historically been denied such rights, and indeed were often considered barely human at all. Instead, previous attempts at recognizing the rights of persons with disabilities, such as the 1971 Declaration of the Rights of Mentally Retarded Persons and the 1975 Declaration on the Rights of Disabled Persons, tended to adopt a medical and charitable model in addressing the needs of disabled people. So in response, beginning in the 1980s, disability activists pressed international bodies and human rights NGOs, most of whom made no acknowledgement of disabled people's rights, to draft and implement a legally binding convention based on a social model of disability. And by social model, we mean an approach that sees social organization, inclusion, and exclusion rather than the physical impairment and biomedical treatment as the sort of area of active struggle, right? And also the locus of intervention. And of course, Berkeley is the home, right, of is an important home for one strand of this movement, which is the independent living movement. So it's a thrill to be here and present this material here. So, adopting a range of methods similar to those of other human rights watch groups, disability activists successfully developed a text that endorses a full range of rights for disabled persons. As such, the convention not only calls for the elimination of discrimination, but makes an implicit claim regarding the standing of disabled persons, that is, that these individuals have a right to rights as human beings. And this is just a map of, and I'm sorry, I know it's tiny, but I just to give you a sense of which nations, right, have signed and ratified the CRPD, which, as I said, was adopted in 2006. And most importantly, to notice that the United States, which signed it in 2006, has failed to ratify and is continually defeated in. So the green areas are the ones that have ratified the convention, and the darker green is the convention and the protocol. The U.S. This is continually fails when in the Senate, right? The Senate Republicans didn't block this. So that is to say, but anyway, to return to the point that I was making, the convention actually is making a claim for the standing, right, that these individuals have rights to rights. And that's to say the CRPD recognizes the specific needs of particularized groups of people as part of a broader trend that legal scholar Frederick Migret calls the pluralization of human rights. At the time of its development, the UN General Assembly administrative mandate actually stipulated that the CRPD be conceived of as an implementation convention, one that did not create any new rights. Yet, as Migret points out, in adding what he calls extra semantic texture to its enumeration of rights with respect to how they pertain to disabled people, the convention acknowledges the extent to which previous proclamations that regard human beings as quote-unquote naturally equal cannot but fail to account for and to remedy the extant social and political inequities that particularized groups such as the disabled face. So even when the rights claims themselves are not entirely new in content, instruments such as the CRPD seem on the verge of establishing new rights because of the measures required of states to ensure that these rights are met for persons with disabilities. For example, the adoption of infrastructure to ensure the freedom of mobility. So freedom of mobility is understood to be a right that we have naturally, so it's a natural human right, but you have to, and so in most cases when we think about natural human rights, is something the state is supposed to negatively not interfere with, but in the case of the disabled person, the state actually has to take on positive measures, right, and create infrastructure, ramps, right, just an example, or elevators, in order to ensure the freedom of mobility of these particular persons. So in short, while Migret remains uncertain as to whether the CRPD generates rights particularly to persons with disabilities, or, quote, simply rights which exist in some form or other for all human beings, but whose existence needs to be highlighted in this context because of the particular vulnerabilities of those with disabilities, end quote, he concludes that the convention opens a normative space for bridging, quote, the gap, sometimes uneasily, between general formulations of rights and the need to craft categories of rights that better take into account the irreducible experience of those with disabilities, end quote. So in turn, as Rosemary Caius and Philip French assert, the CRPD contains measures that have the potential to affect and benefit many persons, such as the right to an accessible environment, as well as the potential to turn rights conventionally assumed to be negative liberties into positive ones of state obligation. So, for example, provisions of augmentative or alternative communication as part of the right to free expression. The recognition in the convention of the specific modes by which disabled persons have been excluded from enjoying rights claims generates what might actually be new rights, such as the freedom from exploitation, violence and abuse, the right to participation, and international cooperation in implementation and monitoring, which are not actually expressly enumerated in other previous instruments. So as a result, Caius and French argue the CRPD modified, transformed, and added to traditional human rights concepts. And a liberal genealogy of rights rooted in natural law tradition, autonomy is understood as the precondition for standing. And this one assumes already possessed by those who are not disabled. So to be like a kind of free and equal human being, you have to have autonomy, right? And that's like how you know yourself as a free individual. But the CRPD, however, actually acknowledges the quote-unquote extra work, the prosthetics, the infrastructure, and the instruments needed for a particular population to arrive as fully autonomous and equal human persons, and seeks to guarantee access to such accoutrements to secure the dignity and personhood of the disabled as political subjects in and of themselves. Ultimately, the Convention seeks to supply to disabled persons the means for social autonomy that, in turn, accord them legal and political personhood, i.e. standing or the right to rights. In this case, as Migret observes, autonomy is, quote, a result of persons with disabilities treatment by the state and society, so that a right to autonomy would, at any rate, involve the organization of society in such a way as to maximize each individual's degree of autonomy, end quote. So as I contend that the CRPD dialectically records how human rights construct political subjects, rights claims, and communities in a mutually constitutive relation to one another, expressly producing a kind of human person whose political and legal autonomy and equality at once necessitates specific political, legal, and social transformations. And yet, as a human rights instrument, the Convention's very existence is made possible by a prior and necessary recognition that disabled people do in fact comprise human persons to begin with. Like the only reason you have a human rights instrument for disabled people is because we think they're human beings, right? But then you also, in order to treat them as equal human beings, you have to have these instruments in place, right? So we're basically in this kind of paradoxical situation that, and we're facing what Joseph Slaughter has described in his book, Human Rights, Inc., as the tautology teleology problematic of contemporary human rights discourse, whereby human rights are understood to produce precisely those abstractly equal human beings that they always already are supposed to be in quote-unquote nature. So in confronting this paradox, I'd like us to suggest that the CRPD underscores how an ethic of solidarity must underpin human rights principles that center on the person, whereby others provide the means for autonomy, the autonomy, equality, and participation of disabled persons in their social and political communities. Accordingly, Article 19 of the CRPD stipulates both the right to independent living and to inclusion in the community. So who then are these humans on the verge of personhood, and how do they come into being? They certainly do seem to comprise those who, in Jacques Rancière's well-known and paradoxical formulation, quote, have not the rights that they have and have the rights that they have not, end quote. Human rights theory is just filled with these kinds of paradoxes and these circular kinds of tautologies. They have the rights that they have not, that kind of I have a lot of stuff. And it's precisely in the space of this paradox that I suggest that minor cultural forms, rather than hegemonic juridical and legal norms, might undertake the quote-unquote extra work necessary to transfigure disability as the locus of standing in human rights politics. So turning to the 1993 Borderland novel, So Far From God, by the Chicana writer Ana Castillo, and the short story cycle Hema and Koshik from the 2008 collection Unaccustomed Earth by South Asian American author Jhumpa Lahiri, I would like to propose that minor literatures represent and represent human society by positing a shared quote-unquote universal, but I want to trouble that idea of universality, embodied vulnerability, while also remaining attentive to the uneven historical and spatial distribution of that vulnerability. At the same time, they can generate an expansive notion of quote-unquote being well, made possible by alternative formations of social and political community, not seeking to transcend the conditions of vulnerability, but instead to transform them. Hence, as Robert McClure contends with respect to what he calls the geopolitics of disability in the New World Order, quote, a recognition or recognition of bodies beyond boundaries, bodies not yet legible according to the terms of our canonical claims, will continue to open new horizons for thought and action for solidarity and coalition, end quote. In their foundational work, Narrative Prosthesis, disability scholars David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder demonstrate how often figures of illness and impairment provide what they call the hard kernel or recalcitrant corporeal matter of disability, against which cultural texts define a normative symbolic order that such narratives seek to shore up. In contrast, I'm interested in how a human rights approach conjoined with a disability critique, or to a disability critique, allows us to discern where illness, impairment, and injury serve not as metaphors against which we define closure and normalcy, but where, as Michael Davidson so aptly puts it, a prosthesis is still a prosthesis. Beginning with So Far From God, I would have us consider when injury impairment, and illness stand not as figures of objection, but as synecdoches of the social, cultural, and political disability environments that produce disability in bodies and require interventions at the level of social justice. This is actually an artist rendering of Saint Christina the Astonishing, who I'll say a word about in a second. It's not from the novel, I just found it online. I thought it was a lovely picture, so illustration, engraving, I guess. So Far from God offers a catalog of various and ongoing threats to well-being under which women of color live and work. An example of what Jose David Saldivar has called the Nueva Narrativa, So Far from God blends elements of myth and legend, historical romance, magical realism, poetry, folk literature, social and political commentary, allegory, and tragic absurdist farce in order to it's a very hybrid text, to represent that disability environment that comprises the U.S. borderlands of its setting tone, New Mexico, and to portray the material contradictions of global modernity as a series of bodily injuries and social indignities leveled at vulnerable but resilient indigenous and migrant populations. These harms are addressed most directly in the plot lines of each of the text's main characters, Sofia, or Sophie, and her 4 daughters, Esperanza, Caridad, Faye, and La Loca, as she's come to be known by others in her community. And each of these characters, these sisters, dies over the 4 daughters, who I've listed there. Each of them die over the course of the novel. Given names that readily intimate an allegorical dimension to their stories, the characters' embodiment of traditional Catholic virtues at once signals the martyrdom of hope, faith, and charity in the modern world, whether Esperanza's involvement in political and social justice movements, so this is just giving you a little bit of a plot in shorthand, but Faye's investment in the bourgeois work ethic, or Caridad's loving and spiritual benevolence towards others. Moreover, in La Loca's character, on whom I'll focus my discussion today, Castillo rewrites the hagiography of the 12th century Saint Christina the Astonishing to embody a visionary character who breaks with the received knowledge of those around her, standing as an ethical counterpoint to the calcified moral norms of church and state. Ultimately, Sophia's hard-won position, not only as mayor of Tome, which is a position that doesn't even exist, she creates it and campaigns for it and then is elected to it. But she also is the president of an organization that's called MOMAS, M-O-M-A-S, which I'll discuss in a moment. And both of those positions and her sort of ascendancy to them esteem the alternate sorts of knowledge acquired through the loss of her 4 daughters, a wisdom, i.e. Sophia, that breaks with modern rationality, technical knowledge, and liberal values in order to want otherwise. Told by an eminent third-person narrator with a gossipy and archly ironic, although not unreliable voice, So Far from God forwards a vision of social justice bound to a political critique of modern warfare, environmental degradation, and sexual violence. The women of Sophie's family are those whom neoliberalism, quote, quote, gives up, insofar as it produces and abandons these subjects, many of whom, nevertheless, in the end, remain literally to haunt that modern or postmodern world. In So Far from God, women of color experience global modernity not as liberated personhood, but as an extreme vulnerability to the countless injuries and impairments that the current historical juncture spawns, and as the violent tearing away of kin and community that might otherwise sustain their lives when impaired. Yet, in addition to its remarkable expansion of what comprises violence against women, the novel articulates the quote-unquote virtues of these women embody as crucial to their good life, as desiring subjects and political agents, even beyond their deaths, their literal deaths. So beginning with the astonishing death and resurrection of one of its protagonists, so the very opening scene of the novel is like this young girl dying and then being resurrected, right? So we're already in a kind of magical world here. So, and then it takes place mostly in the house of, that Sophia has inherited from her family, and concluding with the establishment of the MOMAS organization, which is short for Mothers of Martyrs and Saints, where the specters of dead women make regular ectoplasmic appearances, again, Castillo's term, to communicate with their loved ones. Castillo establishes a milieu in which, quote, the magical falls within the realm of possibility. That is some critic. Oh, I think it's Saldivar's term. And the fantastic and miraculous become integral to the text's political vision. Revived during the funeral procession and flying up to a rooftop church from where she expounds, and that's what you're seeing here, where she expounds, so So revived during a funeral procession and flying to a rooftop church from where she expounds for the townspeople upon her passage through heaven, hell, and purgatory before being sent back by God to, quote, pray for you all, end quote. La Loca, as she's come to be called by all of those around her, including her family, suffers what Castillo calls a phobia of people for the rest of her life, an aversion which the narrator distinguishes from an exaggerated, quote, an exaggerated fear of germs and contagion, end quote. As La Loca explains, quote, all humans bore an odor akin to that which she had smelled in the places she had passed through when she was dead, end quote, such that her aversion signals a type of allergy to the human condition itself. She grows up and dies, barely leaving her mother's house, but possessing a supernatural sensitivity for which she is regarded as a saint by the surrounding community. Meanwhile, Sophia's other daughters, quote, had each gone out into the world and had all eventually returned to their mother's home. And although the occasions when La Loca let people get close to her, when she permitted human contact at all were few, she never falters in her duty to heal her sisters from the traumas and injustices they were dealt by society, a society she herself never experienced firsthand, end quote. The novel goes on to recount those various traumas and injustices, ones that, at least in the case of Caridad, literally tears her body apart. There's just a tremendous amount of physical violence, right, that the women undergo. So, however, the sisters are also returned, so they return home like these injured persons, but they're also returned to integrated personhood. And these recoveries are depicted as inexplicable, and at the same time, they're the kind of indisputable arrivals of subjects who make claims in their own names, but who are also at once sponsored by the recognition La Loca grants to them in her prayers. So she prays for them, and these bodies that are barely held together because they've been so torn apart, right, by violence and the modern world are restored kind of magically. So, and yet recuperation and health can only improve a temporary state for the sisters, as desire continually moves the novel's subjects into new forms of vulnerability. In offering a realist account of the disability environments in industrial capital, modern warfare, and heteropatriarchy and gender, So Far From God never dismisses conventional social affiliations and political mobilization. Yet, given the extensive injuries that these conditions pose, in order to sustain its minor subjects, the novel must also continually ascribe a magical and mysterious dimension to supplement more expected forms of contestation and resistance. While many critics tend to read So Far From God as a straightforward parody and dismissal of religious and familial institutions for their inherent patriarchal and heteronormative orientations, I suggest that in terms of both form and content, the novel seeks to transfigure extant local traditions and spiritual convictions into alternative social resources for those whom the neoliberal imaginary has given up as lost. Without a critical emphasis on this dialectical relationship, such analyses, these other analyses, reduce the woman's suffering to either the position, their position within repressive cultural traditions, or like kind of old-fashioned patriarchy, or to racial and class inequities that organize borderland life. And unable to grapple with the complex interrelations between the two, such readings have elided how, despite neoliberal claims that the conditions of modern industrial labor and global circuits of exchange have destroyed traditional patriarchy, they often that these relations actually often recompose and elaborate masculine, national, and racial privilege in especially potent forms. To offer a political vision that might counter the refunctioning of traditional norms by modern and postmodern relations of production and social life, the novel does not wholly forgo, but instead continually adapts indigenous and Chicano historical forms and norms to apprehend its characters' lives and grant them social meaning even beyond their physical deaths. So the narrative moves easily between realism and the fantastic, and both aesthetic modes are integral to its rendering of character and plot. Marta Caminera Santangelo has convincingly cautioned against conflating moments of magic in the novel with magical realism per se, lest we miss how often the magical actually displaces or replaces the possibility of collective action in the novel, and how Castillo forcefully highlights the chasm between the magical and the real. However, whereas Caminera Santangelo infers in such fantastic moments what she calls the threat of passivity and escapist romanticism, against which Castillo warns, I contend that the tension between the novel's literal, locally rooted politics, so for example, Sophia becoming the mayor of Tome, it's all wrapped up in this whole story of like her also starting this local sheep herding collective. It's just amazing, really. Like all of a sudden, like there's regeneration in really, practical and recognizable ways, right? Of like the local economy that she sort of drives with her political organizing. So it doesn't, so there's a tension between those kinds of literally locally rooted politics and the novel's literary speculations that actually, I think, mediates its adoption and adaptation of allegorical forms. So the move to allegory, and again, right, like it's signaled for us pretty closely, right away, that we ought to be thinking, beyond just the sort of like literal characters. But this move to allegory is tied intimately to the narrative's feminist and queer visions, both of which are rooted in social realism, but also continually break with it, opening their concerns for nurturing domesticity and wandering desires to the fantastic order that marginalized life worlds make available. In so doing, the novel also extends a remarkable commentary on critical norms that relegate the narrative, or any narrative, to being either on the side of praxis or on the side of escape, and critical norms that thus fail to recognize that, as Daniel Y. Kim has written in a different context, a literary work's value resides not in the politics that it could, quote, never give us anyway, but rather in the politics that it might make us want, end quote. And so far from God, then, we might read La Loca as an ethico-political switch point for relating its thematic treatment of quote-unquote real social, environmental, and bodily damage, and the seeming extravagance of the novel's allegorical execution. Hers is the last death that takes place in the novel, with La Loca succumbing to AIDS as she is inexplicably infected with HIV, despite her lifelong aversion to touching or being touched by other human beings. So like, you literally can't explain how it is, that she ends up dying of AIDS. So if there's no way to reconcile literally La Loca's illness and death with her nearly complete physical isolation from other humans, the occasion of her second death, and of course it's her second death, that she undergoes, moves us to read the mystery of her story as precisely formal allegory, in which an impossible subject is nevertheless conjured or invented as a political agent. Specifically, as McClure has argued, to declare oneself as HIV positive, regardless of one's actual serious status, quote, for the purpose of solidarity, is to come out as something you are not, to come out as something you are, at least in some ways, not, end quote. So by traversing the borders between the real and the unreal, health and illness, life and death, La Loca's plot fuses feminist, queer, and disability perspectives in order to refuse, quote, the fixation on life as understood in strictly medical terms, and to propose instead a communicable disability agency, end quote, and these are McClure's words again, that operates according to the logic of an impossible but enduring political desire. The narrative's indifference to generic spatial and temporal boundaries proves imperative if the novel's disabled subjects are to live on in the face of the injuries which the novel recognizes as too often mortal ones that they endure. The many stylistic and narrative components of Castillo's text are really difficult to discuss in discrete, formal, and structural elements. So I've been trying to just pull out La Loca's, but it sucks in all these other kind of plot lines. And so it's difficult to discuss it without involving these other aspects. And in the longer chapter, I do offer a detailed treatment of each of her sisters and Sophia's stories. But what I just wanted to kind of close this part of the discussion with is how in its many different plots, there's a kind of intricate interwovenness, right? In order to render what one critic designates its quote-unquote sisterhood of social ills. So in its meticulous construction of many subplots, and there are all these other sort of minor secondary characters, and layered representations of the regional setting, the narrative further disrupts clearly demarcated borders between past and present, the personal and the communal, the queer and the straight, the indigenous, the Chicano, and the Anglo-American, the human and the animal, and, as I've just said, and most significantly for our purposes, health or well-being and injury, impairment or illness, as well as life and death. In its hybrid form and content, So Far From God inscribes the complex mediations that assemble its minor subjects and the inevitable concessions that those subjects must undertake. Nothing and no one in this broader world, not even La Loca, is pure, uncontaminated, and immune to the biopolitics and security strategies of the modern state and of global capital. But neither are they entirely unmoored and adrift from their specific social, cultural, and political histories that have constituted the borderlands as such. this quote-unquote contaminated and yet faithful construction of the region as what one critic describes as an anti-utopic utopia of impurity and cultural hybridity, in turn configures the specific approach to identity politics that the novel wields. Disability theorists such as Tobin Siebers have in fact insisted that we ought not to understand disability as the unique feature of a select population, but as a, quote, property belonging to all human beings, end quote, thus urging us to reimagine the human subject otherwise. And I think Jim Lee has this really lovely, kind of formulation. It's like, we will all age, we will all become ill, we will all die, right? And so disability is in all of us, or it is, we are all on the verge, right, of disability. So. In Hannah Arendt's influential conceptualization, the subjects of human rights are characterized by nothing but their vulnerability. Siebers directs us to view fragility, vulnerability, and disability as the definitive component of the human condition, rather than as a negative dearth. In this case, human beings figure not as a collection of, quote, not as a collection of autonomous beings, some of whom will lose their independence, but as a community of dependent, frail bodies that rely on others for survival, end quote. So it's this construction of the vulnerable but desiring human that then also directs my reading of what otherwise might seem like a somewhat different kind of narrative, the Hema and Kaushik stories that conclude Jhumpa Lahiri's collection, Unaccustomed to Earth. So this short story cycle locates the title characters Hema, and I just kind of sketch out some of the characters for you in the stories here. Hema, whose last name is never given, and Kaushik Chowdhury at 3 different moments in their lives, and 2 moments of encounter, years end, Hema's missing. Once in a Lifetime begins in 1981 with Kaushik's family. Kaushik and Hema are sort of young adolescents. And Kaushik's family is returning from India to Massachusetts, where they live with Hema's family for a month upon learning that his mother, Kaushik's mother, Parul, is dying of cancer. The next story, Year's End, tells of Kaushik's introduction 4 years after his mother's death to his new stepfamily, his father having married a widow in India and brought her and her 2 daughters back to New England. And the final story, Going Ashore, depicts Hema and Kaushik's reunion in Rome nearly 20 years later as early middle-aged adults. In Going Ashore, the 2 begin a 3-week-long affair, although Hema is engaged to another man. And upon separating, Hema departs to India for her wedding to Naveen, soon after which she learns she is pregnant, and Kaushik, who is meant to be on a brief holiday in Thailand, dies while swimming during the 2004 tsunami. Given that these stories, like most of Lahiri's work, address middle and upper middle class Bengali immigrants and their children, it would be simple enough to construe the plot's family romance as an allegory for ethnic and immigrant assimilation. In this case, Parul's cancer might signify the quote-unquote handicapping racial and cultural difference that must be discarded and disavowed in order for the next generation to ascend into American good life. So I think, if you go strictly from like the Mitchell and Snyder's narrative prosthesis, right? We could just say like, oh, like you have to get rid of that racial difference, and so to have a kind of normative family romance with the nation, right? You can assimilate it, and certainly. That the beginning of the cycle with adolescent protagonists in a middle-class American suburb seems to set the stage for a Bildung, a narrative of development that resolves the loss of the mother through the heterosexual romance between Hema and Kaushik and their incorporation into the national family. And yet, in deflecting its characters from this expected trajectory, placing and displacing them instead into alternate spaces and modes of affiliation, the narratives want otherwise for these subjects. The story Year's End poses a fragile bond that Kaushik begins to construct with his 2 young stepsisters, Rupa and Hugh, while home for a brief visit during his winter break from Swarthmore. So he's a sophomore or junior in college. And he recognizes a loss he shares with these girls, which brings them together in an affiliation arranged by Dr. Chowdhury, and that they help one another to guard. As Kaushik observes, quote, my presence was proof that my mother had once existed, just as they represented the physical legacy of their dead father, end quote. However, Kaushik abruptly rends that new emerging affinity between them when he finds the girls scrutinizing photographs of Parul that had been hidden away. Quote, you have no right to be looking at those, I told them. They don't belong to you. Do you understand? Words continued to pour out of me, words that should not have been uttered, should not have been heard. And he goes on to be incredibly insulting to about their mother and how she's not as beautiful as his mother. And so it's a really traumatic scene. And Kaushik thus forecloses the shared recognition of vulnerability that the dead mother signifies, instead hoarding the photographs, which he later buries along the coastline near the Canadian border as signs of his own private loss. As he recognizes at the end of the story, quote, "The memory of that night was not now the only tie between himself and Rupa and Pew, eclipsing everything else," end quote. Likewise, Lahiri writes about the first night Hema and Kaushik spent together in going ashore after finding each other in Rome as, quote, "Something precious had been stumbled upon, a newborn connection that could not be left unattended, that demanded every particle of their care," end quote. Bound by shared memories of the lost mother, so Lahiri writes, Hema knew without having to be told that she was the first person he'd ever slept with who'd known his mother, who was able to remember her as he did. Their desire appears as an uncanny return of the familiar, made solid in their new discoveries of one another. The two embark on a heady romance that Hema herself, recovering from a years-long affair with a married man, finds safe because she knows it will inevitably end with her return to the United States and to Naveen. Thus, when on their last day, Kaushik insists that she move to Hong Kong with him, where he's going to take up a new job, a magazine, she bristles against, quote, "the fact that he was telling her what to do. Unlike Naveen, he was not offering to come to her," end quote. And Kaushik dismisses her as a coward and remains cold to her when they part because she refuses him. And while he comes to regret his remoteness in these last moments together, Lahiri concludes his story cycle with another insurmountable rift as she expressly denies that Kaushik fathers Hema's pregnancy. With Naveen as the biological father of the child, the story closes by confirming, quote, you had left nothing behind," end quote. And also there's a kind of really strange interpolation of you as a reader, because in this final story going ashore, the Hema and Kaushik are addressing one another, even into this, even past Kaushik's death. So Hema's still addressing him, and so you're, of course, as a reader, put in the position of receiving that address. How then ought we to read Lahiri's reinscribed family romance, in which Kaushik, the child of an ideal lost mother, figures as the fantasy father impossibly lost to a child not yet born? If nothing remains of Kaushik as a subject, the stories nevertheless preserve Hema's secret desire for him, and it is this wanting otherwise, which is both ongoing, impossible to forsake or to fulfill, that opens out onto what I describe in the larger project as a human rights method. Hema and Kaushik the story cycle, cautions against a teleological construction of the immigrant narrative and its resolution in and by way of the Bildungsroman, insisting instead that we remain attentive to the other possibilities embedded within narratives of development and personhood. In the first story, Once in a Lifetime, the secret of Parul's illness overdetermines the alienation the adults feel towards one another, as Kaushik's mother chooses not to reveal to Hema's parents that she's dying. And the adolescent Hema's own reaction to Kaushik's disclosure of his mother's secret at the story's end is one neither of sorrow, quote, sorrow or sympathy, but an enormous fear of having a dying woman in our home that leaves me disturbed that I had been in such close proximity to disease and feeling at once burdened and betrayed, end quote. A portrait of waxing and waning intimacies, once in a lifetime, depicts the way in which shared forms of bodily recognition. And when Hema recounts how it is that how the two families come to know each other, it's actually that Parul sees Hema's mother at a playground, and she's feeling ill, and Parul's the one who suggests to her that she might be expecting, right? That she might be pregnant, and it turns out she is pregnant with Hema, right? So it's that kind of shared bodily recognition that's taking place in those moments. But then also the severing, right, of those kinds of, and the failure of that kind of bodily recognition. So unable to see disease as anything but a betrayal and a burden to be born. So let me go back here. A portrait of waxing and waning intimacies, once in a lifetime, depicts the different ways in which shared forms of bodily recognition nurture, and the failure of such recognition severs possible affiliations. Read against the extremely brief and fractured bildungs that Lahiri provides Hema and Kaushik, so we don't get like their whole life story in this. We get we get what we need to know in terms of exposition. But these intimations of bonds previously forged and lost are transfigured anew with implications beyond the two families. We learn in Going Ashore that after departing his father's house in the previous story, Kaushik has, in the intervening years, remained aloof from his father and stepfamily. Employed as an itinerant photojournalist who documents military and civil violence and human rights violations across the globe, he seeks to separate himself not only from the victims of such violence, even as he remains a professional witness to them, but from all personal and enduring claims that others try to make on him. It's a momentary reference to his aging body that most crucially queries this line between himself as a first-world South Asian American citizen and his perception of others as distinct from him, especially in their vulnerable and embodied victimhood. Despite the plot significance of Parul's cancer and Hema's pregnancy, the only in-depth description of embodiment that Lahiri offers in these stories comes in regards to a rather minor ocular impairment that Kaushik develops as an adult while living in Rome, and I have the long quote up here. It was in the course of those days that a faint gray speck, smaller than the head of a pin, began floating across his left eye. Kaushik had thought that a gnat was circling his head, and he kept swatting at it, putting out his fingers, trying to flick it. I can always want to perform that. And flicked away, but the speck continued to accompany him wherever he went, quietly tormenting him, and he realized it was within him, that it was not possible to remove it or make it stop. An optometrist explained that it was caused by vitreous gel clumping and pulling away from the wall of his eye, that it was a harmless symptom of getting older. He was told he would grow used to it, and he had more or less not bothered these days unless he were in a bright room with white walls or outside without his sunglasses. It did not affect his driving or his picture taking, and yet it felt like an invasion of the part of his body, the physical sense that was most precious, something that betrayed him and also refused to abandon him, end quote. And although Kaushik experiences the speck as an invasion, the narrative instills it within him, a cue to the vulnerable humanity he shares with all those others from whom he has physically and affectively distanced himself. Moreover, Lahiri juxtaposes Kaushik's consciousness of the distracting speck in his field of vision with unexpected recollections of his mother, both of which tellingly reoccur in Thailand as Kaushik swims towards a deserted cove, unaware of the imminent surging tsunami wave that will kill him. These images appear alongside Kaushik's recollection of an object, quote, unlike anything else, end quote, that he and Hema have viewed in an Etruscan museum on their last day together. Quote, a bronze sculpture of a severely elongated boy's body, a skeleton more than flesh, standing with his arms at his side, end quote. And I was telling people at dinner last night how excited I was to actually find this. It's a real image, it's a real statue right there, sculpture. And it's a third century BCE statue made of bronze. So just before Kaushik dives off the boat to swim to his death, he likens his own shadow in the water to the sculpture. Along with the appearance of the speck and the memory of his mother as a strong swimmer, these three images construct a singular constellation of signifiers for Kaushik's embodied being, which is soon to be lost. While his vision impairment remains only mildly troubling, never disabling his good life, the floater once again, and this time with devastating consequences, cues the vulnerable humanity that is installed within him, and thus can never be escaped. While Kaushik might seem to characterize the idealized autonomous liberal subject having transcended all forms of dependency, the narrative qualifies that accomplishment by posing forms of social recognition, interdependency, and care, first in Rupa and Pugh, and then in Hema, that might otherwise be available to him. By highlighting the insecurities of her characters' existences and partitioning their lives across three stories, Lahiri refuses the novel of individual development and autonomy. Instead, Hema and Kaushik offers up characters whose distinct embodied conditions, Parul's cancer, Kaushik's death in the tsunami, and Hema's pregnancy, present synecdoches of life worlds made unavailable by the temporal and spatial disjunctures of the three stories. Rather than metaphors for the nation into which they are to be incorporated, they are only fragmentary remains, emblems of the complex and shifting historical conditions and networks of social affiliation that have produced them. Although Kaushik has misrecognized vulnerability as a state that one can and ought to transcend, the stories ask us as readers, standing in and receiving the address meant for him, when Hema kind of speaks to him as the you, to consider what material conditions and social supports enable anybody to be well, that is, to imagine their own well-being and to put that vision of self into practice. And like the Etruscan artist's remaking of the human form, as we have up here, a human rights response to the human being caught in such rapidly changing conditions demands tremendous conceptual flexibility with respect to our notions of who embodies a subject of human rights as the matter of that subject mutates over time and space, represented and represented by various actors to themselves and to others. The human rights approach that I'm adumbrating from my reading of Castillo and Lahiri's works enacts a disability critique towards an expansive human right to health and health citizenship, which reimagines disability to reveal how its storied quality invents and reinvents the world we share. And I'm drawing on Rosemary Garland Thompson, a key disability theorist as well. So human rights scholars have described health citizenship and the right to health as a key component of second-generation human rights, conceived of as a positive liberty because it requires active intervention on the part of states. The right to health has not traditionally been recognized within the United States as a quote-unquote natural right, the civil and political liberties enumerated in the Constitution's Bill of Rights and referred to in human rights discourse as first-generation rights. And I just have some language from one document. This language is like reproduced in lots of the kind of core instruments of the international human rights regime. This is from the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And to just give you a sense of like how distinct, like this is not language, right, that we have in our Constitution in the United States, right, to think about like what is a natural right, and yet it's, you know, it is recognized in the international regime as such. So, let's see. Brian S. Turner argues that health citizenship names an essential human right and that tending to public health entails the physical, including environmental conditions to maintain good health. Unlike civil rights, which are so often conceived of as the states refraining from interference from the activities of individuals, health citizenship is fostered by the active efforts of the state and or political collectivities. Moreover, as a human right, the right to health extends to all people within a national territory, regardless of citizenship or immigration status. So a human rights approach accordingly frames health and well-being not as matters of charity or special privileges, but as social justice claims, which extend to migrant workers and other non-citizens as well. The human right to health, therefore, marks the limits of biopolitical and neoliberal regimes to address more expansive conceptions and conditions of well-being. To the extent that it recognizes the structural, environmental, occupational, and economic conditions that must be in place to secure well-being, the broader concept of the right to health that prevails in international human rights discourse moves well beyond the therapeutic and rehabilitative logics of health services and biomedical institutions in order to recognize those aspects of human life that cannot be attained without political will and collective action. Without such rights-based guarantees, the servicing of health needs is imagined in the more limited terms of marketplace commodities for those increasingly fewer individuals who can afford them, or as a dispensation of charity. And when it comes to the right to health, I'm obviously here not deriving a primarily thematic analysis of minor literatures, but a formal one. Especially with Lahiri, these are like middle class, like it's not a question of whether they can afford healthcare, right? But it's about their embodied vulnerability and how we can read that formally in relation to other kinds of political claims. So I hope to have pointed out the allegories that they provide of the variable and unstable experiences of vulnerability and desire that formally unmake and remake the story's subjects as they lose, re-encounter, and come to new recognitions of one another. Likewise, the cultural politics of So Far From God and Hema and Koshik are not to construct disability and illness as political identities in and of themselves. Rather, the something precious, in the language of Hema and Koshik, remains yet to come, at present unformed and still in need of care. Such minor literatures can generate an expansive notion of well-being made possible by alternative formations of social and political community, not seeking to transcend the conditions of vulnerability, but instead to transform them. Thus, the human right to health, as I have been describing it, is neither a self-evident universal norm imposed upon others, nor an alibi for paternalistic humanitarianism that reifies impassive victims in need of charity. Rather, human rights supply the political sign under which subjects lay claims to protections and privileges they have not been granted, transforming themselves as political agents in the process. In turn, health signifies not simply as freedom from illness and injury, but as a granting of dignity to subjects other than the idealized able bodies of liberal American fantasy, and as such yields the possibility of reconfiguring the very idea of welfare for all. Thank you. And this is my favorite, right? Like this, like the reduction of stillbirth rate. Like we imagine it as like constitutional language in our in the U.S. is very difficult to imagine. So, did you want to have a conversation? Should we? Should I
You want to go ahead
is
and
that-
take your questions? Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm gonna grab my water. I'll consider the table if you want. Or I bet yours is.
Are you working with a broad array of minor literatures from which that you think lend themselves to this optic?
Yeah.
And are there certain distinguishing characteristics as to what minor literatures do or don't?
Yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, thank you, because I can give you a chance to talk about the, the kind of trajectory of the book as a whole. As I said, in the beginning, each of the chapters, and this is the fifth of 6 chapters, so each of the chapters takes a kind of core human rights claim, so like the right to standing is where I begin, like to just the right to have rights, what gives anyone the right to have rights, the right to self-determination, the right to security of the person, like bodily integrity, which is how we understand things like habeas corpus, or the right to not be tortured, or things like that, and the right to health. And women's rights, which is a little off center because it's actually focused on a subject, but I'm thinking about it in relation to the right to revolution, which is actually not, but it's a contested, right? It's not actually written into any of the core documents, but I'm kind of playing with the idea of a right to revolution. And the right to health and the right to family, right, are the last two. So the last 2 chapters, this and the right to family chapter, move to what I'm thinking of as like alternative genres from the buildings roman. So the first 4 chapters, I really am focusing on what I'm thinking of as morphs on the building roman. So, and I just to make sure everyone's like, the building roman is of course the novel or narrative of development, right? So it's like the kind of coming into personhood. And so, and working with Slaughter's kind of thesis around that what the building roman does is like reconcile, right, the kind of rebellious person and makes them legible as a human, and it's particularly as a citizen, right, into the social order. So you become like the kind of abstract equal person who deserves rights and that you should always already have had anyway, right? As a natural human being, you become that human being that you were supposed to have been in nature. So what I'm interested in the way then is what I'm thinking of is like morphs in this first 4 chapters of the buildings roman. So texts like Beloved, Toni Morrison's Beloved, or Gesture Life by Chang-Rae Lee, or Dog Eaters by Hagedorn, or like How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accent. So there's a whole range of kind of writers of color and what I'm calling minor literatures. Challenge or rewrite or rework the buildings roman, right, to show the ways in which other possibilities, right, or the ways in which the kind of coming into existence is always dependent on kind of recognition by others, and what that entails. So, but this chapter and the last one, then I want to move away from the buildings roman and really think about the family saga and the family romance as an alternative genre that like is then trying to imagine, because if what's taking place for me in those other chapters is the extent to which is a kind of critique of state formations, right? That the state, like the kind of the sovereign individual, is in a kind of isomorphic relationship with the state as citizen, right? And so the ways in which those morphs in the building roman actually kind of offer critiques of that, then how might we begin thinking about other kinds of political community? Like where do other political communities arise from? And a way to like sort of provincialize the state, like the state and historicize it, right, as like a historic formation, like it is, we've not always lived with like states and like nation states, and like we don't need to forever. And so how do we start thinking, and yet we're kind of waiting, right, we're in like wanting other political communities that may or may not yet exist. And so families become really, the family saga becomes really important for me, and I'm working a lot with kind of feminist and queer theories of like families, transnational families, and as figures for alternative communities. So in these 2 chapters, and I really am like trying to look at the family romance, right? So both those chapters are beginning with stories, sad stories of dead mothers, right? Like mothers who go missing, and how one grapples with that, and then turns to texts that are like we might think of as intergenerational sagas as a way of imagining continuity generationally, but that isn't necessarily about bloodline, right? And it's not the patriarchal family per se. So it takes like traditional notions. It's wanting to reclaim like family, right, as a source of political possibility. Yeah. So, and I think my argument, I could say too, in terms of the types of texts I'm working with, this is so. Have people read So Far from God? It's a great novel. It's really amazing. But it's a novel like that wears its politics, like out there. It is hybrid. And it is very postmodern and like
Castillo in general.
What's that?
Castillo in general.
Exactly, yeah. And but I think some of the other texts that I'm working with are not always necessarily there. Like I think they're often seen as I'm not necessarily always working with texts that are always read as being quite as that are often read as wanting to like claim to the nation, right? Or as having some kind of conservative element to them. I mean, that's not really true because dog ears, we know, is really radical, So, but what I'm interested in, and it's really more reading practice and the kinds of texts, right, that I'm trying to spell out. Because what I found is that, with a lot of these, I just sort of was like, I remember when I started working on this, someone asked me to do a conference paper, and I was like, okay, so what, I want to do something with the right to health. I wonder what text, I'm like looking at my bookshelf, and when you're writing a conference proposal, you're just like, I'll talk about, and I was just, I'm looking at my shelf, and I'm like, I think I'm going to write on Unaccustomed to Earth, and I think I'll write on Tamakoshi, because there's some illness going on in there, right? But, and so in some ways it's really a hypothesis, right? That if you bring this kind of reading practice, you can, to these texts that are often, aren't really read as having this kind of more capacious sort of political, like cultural politics to them, what can you unlock? And it has been extraordinary to me, like how often I have been right, like I just said, it actually works, to do the close readings. With this particular, looking for the kinds of claims in the language, so around personhood or around, vulnerability, or sorry, I don't have that long quote up anymore, but that when I looked at that moment, that idea of it being instilled within him, right, as a kind of embodiment, that just, I knew I was onto it, right, so I'm often, it's been this kind of hypothesis in some ways to like that, bringing a human rights framework, rather than want to say like a civil rights belonging, right, kind of like notions of abstract belonging, will actually unlock, right, across a range of writers, other kinds of possibilities. And that's, for some, is an active, I think for some writers, really an active, kind of political project, but I think for others, it's inherent because of the contradictions of like U.S. citizenship, of American citizenship, and so it takes some reading against the grain in some cases, but it's still very much there. So those long answers.
I mean, in a way, that's kind of what I got out of your talk. I mean, it sounds like what you're saying is that your project ends up, what you gave the talk from was where your project ends up.
Yes.
Right, in terms of alternative universalisms
exactly.
imagined by these minor literatures, which seems to me really interesting when put together with disability as the particular right that is the human right that, as you say, isn't simply an implementation.
Or it's a human rights subject, right?
As the human rights subject that is, or form of right, that isn't simply the implementation, right? Yeah. But rather manages to do some re-theorizing. It seems to be the standpoint for which re-theorizing can be done regarding human rights as a kind of positive right rather than a negative right, a positive liberty rather than a negative liberty. So putting together the possibility for disability as the standpoint from which to mount a discourse of a positive freedom in relationship to the alternative universalism that minor literature affords seems to be a potential optic for also, as you say, the earlier literatures you look at as well in the first part, so they're not just sort of reinstantiating the kind of critique that Slaughter already affords us regarding the bind of an abstract universal individualism, but rather something mounted from within, right? The minor literature that gives us something more positive in a way is what I'm getting at. Yes. Yeah.
Yes. You did a lovely job. That's exactly what I have been sort of thinking about. That human and so I tend to talk about human rights politics, right? That it's like it's works in progress, and the subject of human rights is a work in progress, right? So that we're always constructing, like when we lay claims, when we talk about like new rights that are emerging, like the rights, right? That they also then like re-envision what the human is, not only to those that like we think of as disabled, but like even if you're able-bodied, like all of a sudden you have a new sense of like what your rights might be. Like a freedom from violence, right, is not actually, listed anywhere. I mean, that's sort of mind-blowing, right? Like that it's not actually listed anywhere in any other document, right? But it becomes a document that we all enjoy, whether we're able-bodied or disabled, right? And then that allows us to think about like what it means to be human in really different, right, terms, social and culturally. But it requires the kind of social and cultural resources to be able to produce, right, those rights in the first place. So I think, Slaughter's book, like, he talks about, he'll say that if you turn to other genres, right, there might be other kinds of possibilities. So, like, I think he mentions, like, the picaresque, right, is, like, one. But he really kind of stays within, and I talk to him about this all the time. He hates the books that he reads. And when I asked him about his archive, he says he has this, like, this bookshelf of, like, post-colonial buildings around, like, world novels that he just finds, like, trite and, like, repetitive, and they all do the same kind of thing. I'm like, yes, they do. But minor literature is actually, which is why I love working on these texts, right? That they actually they intervene, right, in ways, and they're really kind of self-conscious about the failures or impossibilities of producing that kind of a narrative, right? So,
To what extent do disability social movements at this point sort of use the human rights discourses that are written?
And what about
the social movements of disabilities? Are you also using? Are they engaged in the same logic, and are you also drawing on that set of production of sort of material around the arguments of disability rights? How different are they? I guess
the disability and the human rights.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a really complicated field of and I really just started wading into disability with this chapter. So, and in fact, again, that conference, it came out of like a conference paper years ago it was on disability and illness. And I should say that I have published some of the stuff on Hema and Kaushik, but I've expanded on this, and I was assuming people aren't reading everything, right? But it is a special issue of Amerasia that Jim Lee and Jennifer Ho co-edited, and that was a panel at AAAS a bunch of years ago. And he asked me, I think, to do some disability, but I thought, I'm going to write on the right to health, right? Because I wasn't quite sure, like, exactly how I was thinking about it, and I was really new to disability studies. And what I've learned over the years, and so, it's an interesting, there's an interesting tension, right? Because there is, I think, within the field of disability studies and disability activism, right? A certain strand that is very much tied around, an identity politics, right? So it is about, drawing the parameters of what it means to be, who counts, right, as disabled and who doesn't. And then you have disability theorists like Tobin Siebers, I think, who are trying to, and they are theorists, right, so they're trying to theorize disability really differently. So it's a tricky, and I have a footnote somewhere, that it isn't necessarily, but I find it just much more useful, right, to have this kind of broader theoretical notion of disability that does work that queer does, right? In another kind of context, refuginess is another term that I've heard, right? Where instead of thinking about fixed positions, right, that they become analytics for thinking normative conditions, right? Like normative conditions of health, et cetera. And especially in the U.S. context, right? The ADA, the Americans with Disability Act, it has its logic really ultimately is one that's tied to a kind of it's like a strict scrutiny kind of it's very limited, and it's very much tied to a logic of equal sort of abstract equality, right? And the disability movements, and I only know this because I have a student who's working on this, right? So the extent to which even while the disability activist movement, especially around the ADA in the U.S., really drew on models of civil rights politics, right? In things like civil disobedience and things like that, and kinds of protests. So those earlier models, there's a huge cleavage in terms of the claims. So one of the things you have, for example, is the extent to which disability activists have tried to get care workers for disabled people out of, in New York State and California State, right, the kinds of new domestic worker minimum wage laws, right? like disability activists have actually asked, have tried to get exemptions, right? And so, and of course this care workers tend to be women of color, right, people of color. So the kind of, like without this sort of, I think, more capacious and intersectional way of thinking disability, right, like you end up with these kinds of divisions, right, thinking of, on one hand, like that, so that precisely a political movement that builds upon, like, struggles for racial equality also then can, continue to sort of keep in place really, economic inequities that fall most hard, right, on people of color. So this is why I turned to disability theory in the same way, like to disability theory rather than to say like the kind of activism. But a lot of activists also are, and I just picked up a book on like the history of the social movement around the CRPD, and one of the pieces is by. He was one of the members of the ad hoc working group for the CRPD, and one of the problems early on was that there were like no disabled people even like working on the convention, right? And then there was like, and then eventually they, and it was amazing, right? In the end, they actually, and some part of this collection is arguing that like having the presence of disabled activists in the room writing the documents, right, was incredely important, right, for understanding like what kinds of rights claims ought to be laid out in the instrument. And he uses the language of imagine, right? So he's a member, he's deafblind, right? And he was elected sort of, he was in a leadership role anyway for a particular organization for the deafblind. And he uses, the whole piece is this like beautifully written manifesto that's all like in the language of like imagine this and imagine that, right? So I think there's this way in which, there's still this possibility of like creating a world that isn't tied in necessarily, like it isn't a wounded attachment, right? But it is about like possibilities. So.
I don't have a fully formulated question, but listening to your talk, something popped into my head. If you think about a lot of the recent controversies in America, right, about contraception, or abortion, about gay marriage, what's happening in Arizona, with racially and in terms of refusing service to gay people. I had thought of all of those things in terms of civil rights until now, but listening to your talk, it suddenly seems like people are trying to disable these people, right? So it seems that rather than thinking about all of the sort of kind of very conservative movements going on right now in America as going back to the Jim Crow era and simply issues of civil rights, it seems that it's actually fight over who gets to be seen as able-bodied and thus eligible for citizenship, and who needs to be disabled again for those citizens to retain their citizenship. So I was wondering if your way of reading might actually intervene in how the canon is thought of, because you're working with minority literatures, and I think minority literature is sort of emerging into the canon in university courses has followed a particular path that is really built on the Bowman's Rule on.
Right, yeah.
So maybe could you discuss a little bit about how your way of reading might actually intervene in also sort of the canon and the struggles of the canon at the university?
Yeah, so one of the things that I would say, I think you're exactly right. Well, I mean, there are people much better at this and doing much more, like in-depth kind of analysis, but the extent to which racialization has always been has, so eugenics and, it's always spoken about in the language of, it's like medicalizing language, right? It's about disabling language, right? So the two things are so close, like racialization is seen as a kind of form of disability, right? That so one has to be recovered from that. And so, so that's the idea that like, the racial and ethnic is like a handicap, right? That one has, that you have to kind of get over. And I think, so that, so I think you're right, that like, so that this is why, I think the kind of work that scholars are doing that's intersectional, that brings disability into kind of the conversations around intersectionality are really important. In terms of, I could say a word about like the term minor in particular, which is doing a lot of different kind of work for me. Part of what I want to do is play on this idea of like not yet arrived, right? Like so we're like still, so the way that you're a minor in law, right? Like you're not actually don't have full standing yet, right? You will one day, but become a full citizen with full political rights, but you're in terms and legal rights, but you're a minor subject. So how but you're still a subject, you still have desires, and you still have claims that you're making, right? So, of course, it's about racial, so it is persons of color authors, writers of color, and so the minor literatures. But I'm also using the sort of Deleuze and Guattari, the way in which they speak of minor literatures is like, it's written in the major language, right, that does a kind of deterritorialization of precisely like the major canon, right? So, so it's sort of writing back against or deterritorializes. And for me, like that's actually partly also, I think that this is like a project that's really interested in the diaspora and transnationalism, right? Because it's about the kinds of linkages, and this, well, no, it did come out, right? And like the kinds of ways in which the displacements and they leave New England and Massachusetts, right? And they're like all over the world, right? And that's part of it, and that displacement in these other parts of the world become, and there's I have a longer discussion about how Rome and the Etruscans actually figure into this, because she's actually Hannah's supposed to be a scholar of the Etruscan, she's a scholar of Latin, right, classical works, but she's looking for fragments of Etruscan, right, kind of like text within the Latin text, right? So like to me, which is giving us a reading method, right, for reading the story. So it's like if she's looking for these fragments, right, like what are we, like how do they figure, right, that except as fragments of worlds that we don't have access to, in the same way that sort of Etruscans are this we can only access them through the classical text, right? But these kinds of pieces that point us to other worlds that did exist before, right? Before the Romans took over, right? Before the Roman Empire. So I want to think about like how diasporic and transnational linkages, right, to other peoples and other places about subjects that are located within and that we think of as American subjects, right? Not only reconfigures political claims, right, so that they become like these international human rights claims, but also our canons of literature, right, so that there's this move towards, what were we talking about last night, the planetary, right, that and in post-colonial studies, right, that kind of like rethinking world literature, right, as planetary. Well, and so often like U.S. writers of color are like kind of left out of that discussion, right, because they're understood to be provincial, to be American, right? And to some extent, I think post-colonialists makes me pull my hair out. I think that a good number of post-colonialists don't want to deal with even American writers of color, right? Because they don't because it's the U.S. is a hegemon, and yet we don't want to determine everything, right? But even from within the belly of the beast, right, we have these kinds of I think these ways of deterritorializing. And so I would like to think about something like any of these writers, or something like Beloved, which is what I'm working on now at the moment, which seems like such, it's chattel slavery in the U.S., right? That is it's a peculiar institution, and it's peculiar to the U.S., right? But I think it actually has implications for the ways in which American good life has been exported to the rest of the world, right? And so that's a text that ought to be read as planetary literature, I think, right? But it's read as American lit, right? And an important American piece of American literature, but nonetheless, right?
Beloved really poses a challenge for my non-U.S. students in my non-U.S. classroom, because they understand that African Americans are a minority in America, but they don't understand how Toni Morrison's Beloved could be seen as minority literature.
Right.
And so it poses a particular challenge in a particular way of seeing America.
She's a Nobel Prize winner, right? Yeah.
And they also think, well, slavery is about America. America is about slavery. Therefore, how more mainstream could it get?
Yeah.
So they have real issues about what gets classified as minor versus major.
I also wanted to think to your question too that this project, just my interest in human rights came out because I was trained by a post-colonialist, right? And so when I, as a student, when I was reading, I had some interest. When I was an undergrad, I was in Amnesty, the campus chapter of Amnesty International, or whatever. And then I got to graduate school, and I was taught that that's these humanitarian, and then human rights are these things that we export to the global south, and we judge, and they're it's constantly ways of judging the inadequacy, right, of and the capacity for self-governance and of other nations, right? So and I came back around when I was reading Latino studies, legal scholars actually, right? And it was around Proposition 187, and for many of you, I think, might not remember Proposition 187, right? But not unlike SB 1040. like the Arizona, right, case where the kind of profile, like so many of the arguments were based around like notions of like formal equality, right? Like so, you know, you'll be racially profiling, right? And you might profile people who are citizens, and you know, just because we know it's racial, right? And so, and that always seemed really strange to me because it was like, you know, you do write off those who are undocumented, right? Like, well, you know, yeah, they don't belong here, but what the problem is going to be is that you're going to have these, you know, that you're going to take people who are like actually U.S. citizens and violate their rights. And Latino scholars were, legal scholars were like, we need a better, you know, political and legal framework for thinking, you know, the norms of our politics around, you know, 187. We need a human rights, right? Because it's like, regardless, like, you know, there are standards, there are international standards for, you know, around detention and habeas corpus, and you know, and that's what we need to, you know, and that ought to be the grounds that we think about this one, how one has standing as to having right to rights, not on like the question of citizenship. So then I got really, you know, sort of, I decided I wanted to come back to human rights, right, and thinking, but specifically turning them back upon the U.S., right? So as a way of thinking about kind of an ethical counterpoint to the legal and political norms within the U.S. So.
I appreciated the section you put up here, the Article 12, and I was interested in how some of the provisions seem more relevant perhaps for non-first world, non-Western nations. So for example, the reduction of stillbirth rate and infant mortality and the healthy development of the child. And I was wondering how this more international idea of health citizenship, what it means to bring that to bear on a U.S. context where U.S. minor literature.
So what I didn't get to do, I just kept gesturing at the realist account in the novel, but this novel is set in New Mexico, right, and it's all about environmental degradation, and a couple of the novels I want to work with, right, are about pesticides, about, you know, it's about migrant workers in the U.S., and so they're borderland novels, right, they're like about migrant workers and the kind of conditions that they live in. The character of Faye, I think it was, yeah, Faye, works in a factory. They're like industrial. It's industrial cleaning solvents for military parts, right? For weapons parts of weaponry, and she ultimately, you know, like they're like, and there's no safety and occupational, right, kind of standards in place, and it's all, and of course it's all illegal, right, but it's taking place anyway, and she ends up dying of cancer, but her body's like just literally eaten away by the toxins, right? So part of like my interest in the novels, and this, like when I say like the realism is there, right, is actually like, you know, yeah, like the right to health is one that, like, especially for persons of color, right, like workers of color in the United States is very much at risk, right, and access to, you know, it isn't, when we say the right to health, there is this, like, but it's like, first of all, just access to healthcare, right, it was like, is a major access, but it's not the only thing, right, that, like, but even in the U.S., it's like, oh my God, I'm trying to like pass healthcare, right, laws. It's like, we just see how, you know, crazy that is and how difficult that is, and how, you know, and it isn't necessarily that, like, actually, you know, what public health scholars, you know, find is that polls show that Americans do want, right, some kind of, like, that they do think that healthcare is a right, like, for the most part, like, they think, and yet, how, like, so it isn't as if everyone thinks that, like, healthcare, you know, we tend to think, like, Americans are really conservative about that, but they're not. But, you know, but the ways in which their intention with, you know, our notion of, like, the role of the government, right, and that kind of thing. So first I would say, the first thing I would say is that, you know, like, some of those conditions are very much alive, and precisely because they play, like, because of the discrepancies, right, in the rates, and I'm not, you know, I don't work in public health there, but it's just, you know, you can just read just about anyone who does this kind of work on, like, structural, what do they call that, structural, like Jonathan Metzel's work, right, is really great, because he's like, you know, like, poverty makes you sick, right? And so, you know, the rates of illness amongst people who are poor, right, are going to be much higher. So, but also, one of the things that I do love about the novel too is the extent to which, like I said, they're like really intricately interwoven. So someone like Esperanza actually goes like abroad to, like she's a journalist and she ends up going to Saudi Arabia to cover what's like basically the first Gulf War, and she's captured and she's disappeared basically, right? And she's never recovered. That's her death in the novel. And Faye's story about these industrial solvents that are used to clean military parts, right? There's this beautiful way that it links to like understanding that those military parts are then like being shipped abroad to kill, right? Like in a war, right? So part of this is also the extent to which in a globalized world, right? Like the first world also creates the suffering, right? And like of others and the disabling of others elsewhere. And so, you know, the rights are actually not just like state right, like within the state, right? But that they actually require kind of transnational solutions as well. So that would be the other side of the answer, I think.